Welcome to the Christian Heritage Podcast. This is Roy, and I'm actually going to be your host for this podcast. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that James and I are about to have. So I'm really excited about this. Hopefully you heard the first two episodes right before this one. And, you got to learn a little bit about me and my backstory. But as James and I, as we kind of figure out content for the podcast, as we talk about, what do we want to talk about? What do we want to highlight? We thought it'd be great for you get to know a little bit about our other host, right? And James. James does such a great job with the podcast. I love just the behind the scenes work he does with this. I don't know where he gets all the capacity to do what he does, but really grateful for him. And we thought it would be great to say, hey, let's get to know James a little bit more. So, hey, let's give a warm welcome to James. What's up, man?
I'm glad I'm on this side, and I'm the one at home today. You were at home last week or
That's
2
right.
weeks ago whenever we recorded yours. And so now we've switched. The tables have turned. So
they have turned.
Yeah.
And you're at my mercy now, James.
Yep.
So
you got the hot mic. So
I do.
It's your show.
I have control. So I'm excited about this. So as James and I talked about, us getting to know James a little bit more, James and I said, well, do we really talk about the beginning of our relationship? So that is actually where we're going to start, because I think it will provide a lot of context for just the internal workings. I hope it will share a little bit of our heart. I think it's always important to know the heart of your leaders leading an organization. And we've talked about that before, on this podcast. So I'm going to shed a little bit of light. So how James and I started our relationship. So actually, James, well, I'll give context of this, and then I'll have you just share. Yep. So I was about 3 months in. So I started, I came in December of 2020, right? 2020. Really up and running in January. And I remember one of the very first conversations about 3 months in with our chairwoman of the board, and said, hey, we need to start talking about a succession plan. And I was kind of thrown for a loop because I'm like, I'm it, ain't I? Like I'm only been here 3 months. But she says, one of the things that we need to really be talking about is, are there people within the organization who, as we go through, we think about succession and we think about, something happens to you, which, we've talked about before here at Christian Heritage. That's a very real fear and concern, with Greg's tragic, death in 2014-15, Lisa then passing away just a few years later. You've got to have a plan in place. Our former CEO, who I replaced, Brad Brown, did a remarkable job kind of stepping into that gap, and then personal circumstances for him as well ultimately ushered him out, which is where, I came in. So succession is an important part of every organization's, health. I think the stronger succession plan you have, I think the healthier the organization is. So this is really important to this organization. And so that conversation with, hey, Roy, we're glad that you're there, but we need to be thinking about, are there internal people who you could see as successors to, being in there? And by the way, that's still a hard conversation just 3 months in, because I'm still like, who's who, where's the toilet paper, all those kinds of things. Where's Nebraska? Like, how do I even navigate Lincoln, let alone what I think about the future of the organization? But in that conversation, I think the board already had a short list of, here are a couple of names of people to reach out to in terms of, there's really no one internally. What does that look like? And along came the name James Bruce. So James, do you want to give a little bit of backstory of how the board was aware of you?
Yeah. So my first connection to Christian Heritage was as a foster parent.
That's right.
My wife and I were licensed foster parents. We just did respite. And then we had our fourth child, Isaac. And so then we didn't have space in our home, still in the same home that we were in then. And so we just did respite, let our license expire. And that's when Brad was the CEO. And then there was that transition period where he had to depart. And we were also at the same time wondering what God had next for us. My wife and I were on staff with Cru, Campus Crusade for Christ. So we were campus ministers, campus missionaries here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We had been doing that for a while. Before that, I was a pastor, and this was my second stint with Cru. And I think we were getting to the point, both of us, for some of the same and also different reasons, where we're like, I think we've just hit our shelf life with college ministry specifically. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, but we just sense God kind of stir in our hearts. But when you've been in ministry your whole life, you kind of go, man, what can I do next? Like, I'm not going to go work on Wall Street. I just can't go get any kind of job, no technical kind of things. And so we really wrestled, and we were like, and I particularly wrestled. I just felt like, God, I don't know what you want. I think you want me to take a step towards something else personally, but I don't know what that is. So just really through the magic of, Indeed and whatnot, I found that Christian Heritage had listed that they were looking for a CEO. And I remember talking to a few people who used to be involved with Christian Heritage way back when, and I kind of picked their brain, and I was like, I don't even know if I'd be a good fit for this. And one of them, who was a former board member, he just said, I think you should apply. It kind of took me aback that he said that, but I did apply for the role, got a call really quickly, actually, from one of the people on the search team, did a phone interview. And just like any other first-time interview, especially on the phone, since you can't see faces, you kind of go back and you're like, you say, I said to my wife, like, man, there's no way they're calling me back. Like, that was, you just think it's the worst 5 minutes, in the world. Actually, I did that with the first job I applied to, or not the first, but one of the jobs I applied to be a pastor. And I thought it was horrible. And it was the one that I ended up getting. And we ended up moving to New York to be at this church. So I remember I was right out behind our house here in the parking lot of Christ Place, because I needed a quiet place because our kids were little. And I'm sitting in the car having this interview. And I remember talking about, strategic planning and vision and all that kind of stuff. And so then I did an in-person interview, and then after that, the committee decided to go in a different direction. And some of it was, I hadn't worked in the field long enough, and there were some, just technical details that I didn't meet in terms of the Department of Health and Human Services. And so it just kind of stopped. And we stayed with Cru. We kept our chin down, and we're like, obviously this isn't meant to be. And there really wasn't a good fit with any other organizations, companies, had a few opportunities, and we just sensed like, this isn't what God wants. And then that's when you had reached out to me. I think it was probably late April, early May of 21.
Yep.
And, you sent me a message on LinkedIn, and you're like, hey, are you still open to some position here at Christian Heritage? And I remember telling my wife, and I was like, who sent me a message on LinkedIn today? And she's like, who? I was like, Roy Baldwin. And she's like, who the heck is Roy Baldwin? And I said, well, he's the new Christian Heritage CEO. He must have just taken the job. I didn't see anything public. Really, I didn't talk to anybody at CH. And so that was really the beginning of our relationship. And I remember we met at Scooters, and
we did.
You had told me what you just shared here to start this episode. And that really started for Carly and me this period of praying and just exploring if this is what God would have for us. And I think it took about 6 or 7 months, right, before there was actually a job offer to join the team. And I know there were so many details that went into that, and we had to figure out if we were a good fit. And of course, and I'll say this, not just, I'm sure Roy will, but like, there was nothing promised to me about, when I ride off into the sunset, James, you'll take over. It wasn't like that.
Right.
I wanted to be a part of something where I could use my gifts and my skills and my passions, but also to be a part of a great mission. And that's what I found when you and I talked for we probably met once a month, if not more.
I think so.
During the summer, it was maybe a couple times a month where we really had to vet each other and figure out if this is something that we both wanted, if God wanted.
Yep.
And so that's how it started.
Yeah. One of the things, as I reflect back on that time, because I think one of the things I've appreciated about our relationship, is just the candidness, of, dude, like when we talk about succession, like, Roy, what are you thinking about that? I'm like, I just got here. Like, I just transplanted my family from New Hampshire. Like my goal has never been to, I have a 5-year plan and, all of that. It's like, so I think as we work through the kind of the initial awkwardness of, I think those conversations, we were able to get through those layers and really just kind of lean in and think about, alignment with philosophy, what we believe about God's word, what we believe about vulnerable children and families, what we believed about the church's role in vulnerable. And I think as the more that we talk, the more that we shared a common language, the more that we believed in the same things. I think there's a lot of similarities in our leadership style. I think there's similarities. And so as I was thinking about, if I have someone who I can just come in and just see the amount of change management that the organization is about to go through, because you're right, at that time, no one even knew me. I don't even know at Christian Heritage even announced at that point, hey, we have a new CEO. Like it was coming in and really assessing and learning. And we've grown so much over the last 3 years. But it was a very different experience for me coming in and then seeing, is there anybody really internally who had a long-term view of the organization, and no fault of anybody. I mean, these are some of the not difficult, but something like, hey, you've been here a long time. Is any desire? And honestly, no one really wanted the seat. No one really wanted this role. And so part of that is like, well, I need to find someone who at some level has the desire to leading this organization in the future. And I think it's in those really awesome, candid, vulnerable kind of conversations that we saw God really starting to show up. And I know I did, in regards to, man, if something happened to me tomorrow, I need someone who really wants this role and is going to take it all, who's able to lead and take it all on, and has a heart for it, because there was a reason why I was hired. There was a reason why I was brought in, and I needed someone who was similar in its level of risk taking, someone who was, similar in, galvanizing a team. So I think there's some similarities in our, personalities, although there are definitely some distinct differences. But that was the one thing that I loved. And we created a role for you so you could start, that process. I think one of the other things, and we'll get a lot more into your backstory, but one of the things that I have loved here at Christian Heritage is really has been our ability to set aside our egos. And I don't mean that in a sense of hey, let me brag on us, but I
not in an egotistical way,
not in an egotistical way, but we've really had to set aside our egos and our own agendas in regards to making, I think, this work, and how openly we have been with, at that time was our senior leadership team at that time. We've shared this with the staff. Like nothing has been promised. This has been, hey, we have similar hearts and sentiments. We have someone that we want this, who ultimately would love to have this job. How do we begin this process? So we've always been very open about promising and saying, me 3 years in, like, I still want to do this job. You're 2 years in, like, I still love what I do. And really what you've done has been really remarkable in terms of building on the really incredible heritage and foundation that both of us have inherited. I mean, we've had some great people in these roles, but we've been able to really take what they've established and begin to grow it, build it, and extend it in really some really powerful, unique ways. And so, but I think it has required our ability, and I know it has for me. I mean, those aren't easy things to say. Like, no, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, but really surrendering that to the Lord is like, my life is done. And we talked about this, with me in terms of my own life and all the circumstances that I've had, is God was preparing me for this. And then quickly on, oh my goodness, like I do need to have a succession plan. The board needs to have confidence in the succession plan.
Yeah.
And how do you lead through that? And it does require a complete surrender and obedience
Yep.
to the Lord's agenda, not mine.
Yep.
And so I think if anything, I hope that people have confidence, not necessarily in every decision we will make, because
Yeah.
on a daily basis, we disappoint we disappoint people.
Oh, yeah.
But at least at the end of the day, know that we're very intentional with trying to set aside our own agendas, our own, personal stuff, and really thinking about God's kingdom, vulnerable children and families, and how do we position the organization for long-term sustainable growth so we can continue to, be in this fight for, greater health and ultimately to see children flourish in the face of adversity and trauma in Christ. And, we are more than up for that task. And that ultimately is what I have loved about, you joining the team and being a part of us turning the tide and refining our conversations around, what that actually looks like here in Nebraska. So,
yeah. I think that when we met, sometimes you meet people where you're like, I feel like we've always been friends.
Yeah.
And it kind of felt like that because
agreed.
like you mentioned, we spoke the same language. And so, you can, and I don't mean this to denigrate a Christian or any other Christian, but you can believe the same things theologically, but you see the world differently.
Right.
Or you see a particular field, in our case, child welfare and child well-being, you can see that differently.
Well said.
You could see the church and kind of the way that the local church system, the big C, capital C church system works differently. And we didn't have that. And so we saw the world similarly, though we don't agree on everything all the time. Obviously, that's ridiculous to think that.
Right.
Pardon me. But we had what I would call is we kind of had the same set of lenses on. And so as we're looking through at the church, at child well-being, at flourishing, we did literally use the same kind of words, the same language. Right. And so then you feel at home. We talk about felt safety. Like I felt safe. And I mentioned in our episode a couple of weeks ago, there's a reason why I say, oh, Roy is probably the best boss I've ever had. And so if I lead at CH or another organization someday, like I'm going to lead the same way as Roy, not because I'm just copying, but because we're kind of cut from the same cloth. Right. And you'll probably find out why as we go through this, conversation. And after having listened into, the interview I did with you, I think people will see like, oh, there's a reason why you see the world the same way and why you get along so well. And so that just made me feel safe.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's so well said, because I think that's where you're right. The alignment was and again, as we learn more about your story, I think we walked away from our experiences with some of the same sentiments, the same perspectives of the church's role, what we believe about ministry, what we believe about vulnerable children, and I think this is, as you see, our new mission and vision, that really has been formed in the furnaces of not just our lives, but I think with a lot of the people here at Christian Heritage and even those who support us, these have been formed in the church is the answer to what we see in our communities, in our culture today. How do we help mobilize that? But that has been birthed out of testing and fire and trials and challenges about what we do that from very different perspectives. But I think we've walked away with those same lenses. So yeah, I agree. I think that has been, the rallying point, not just us, but for our senior leadership team and so many other critical people who are a part of, the life flow, the daily flow of the work that we do here. So that's really good.
Yep.
All right. So let's shift a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about James. So James, tell us, I'd love to know a little bit about your family. So what's your, life stage you're in right now? And then share a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah. Well, I'm married to Carly. We've been married for 14 years. We have 4 kids. The ranges from 12 to 4. And so we are a busy home. But I mean, I love my family. I love the fact that we live in Lincoln. I love our church. We're a part of First Free here in Lincoln. My wife actually works part-time at First Free. She writes some content, Bible studies, sermon guides, stuff like that. She works with life groups. And so that goes back to a part of that where we were trying to switch,
Right.
modes of ministry. And I think she wanted a new challenge and something different. And God provided that after we had been a part of First Free for a while. Yeah. So I'm from Nebraska originally. My wife is too. We actually met at the University of Nebraska in Campus Crusade for Christ. And so that's how we got to know each other. We actually did a lot of ministry together. We did a lot of international ministry together. And so while I was late to understand trauma and child welfare, I was connected to people who had a different kind of trauma moving to a country where they didn't know
Right.
anything. And that's really where Carly and I connected. And so we had a ton of friends from China, especially, and other countries as well. But we really bonded over that. And I think what we found was, man, this is another person, not just that I'm attracted to and I like, but like I could see myself doing ministry with them for the rest of my life. And so really that's how we met, connected, and I think why God put us together. And so we loved doing ministry together, and we really loved our time, with Cru together. And that was unique. And even the time that I was a pastor at the church in New York, like we served together, we served in different ways, but that was a really special time in our life. So, and our kids are awesome. I mean, they're amazing. It's fun to see them grow. That's kind of the stage of life where we're at the stage of life where like you know enough about parenting to know that you don't know anything. And you're like, I don't have all the answers. And every new day is a new thing because each kid is experiencing this for the first time. And I didn't just experience it with my oldest. Now I'm experiencing it with our second or our third or our fourth because they're a unique person. And so, life is a little chaotic. 4 kids, 3 different schools. We used to homeschool. When I say we, I mean mostly my wife, and I was the sub that the kids didn't always, I don't want to say didn't listen to, but it was hard being sub for homeschool. Right. So, so we're also in a new stage of life in that way, in that this is the first year they've, now they're in school and not at home. Yeah. So a little bit about my upbringing. I never remember a time not hearing about Jesus. My parents became followers of Jesus before I was born. And so they really did a great job introducing us to the faith. And we weren't super involved in church in terms of like all the activities or small groups, but we were faithfully a part of a church, and parents did a great job teaching us about Jesus, teaching us the scriptures. And man, I think that I've said this before, like, if I had it one way or the other, not growing up and not knowing anything about God or being taught about him, I'd pick the one where I'm taught about him. We just heard at church from Camp Sunshine was actually doing a training for our youth volunteers on Sunday. And, they are kids volunteers, and Jeff, who's the director there, said something like, Barna has done some research, like kids have their spiritual beliefs set by the time they're 12, and then they spend the rest of their life justifying whether that's right or wrong. And so, I'm glad that my wife and I know Jesus, and we raise our kids to know Jesus, but I'm so grateful that my parents raised us to know the Lord. So
yeah.
Good. So I think I mentioned I'm from Omaha originally, so a city kid. And I love living in Lincoln now. I prefer it to Omaha. No offense to all my Omaha friends. But yeah. So that's a little bit about my background. I started following Jesus probably when I was in college, but I grew up knowing a lot about him. It just didn't really sink. Like the penny didn't drop for me until I got to college and I was living in community with other people who wanted to follow Jesus.
Right.
I was the oldest of 3. And so there were times where I would get bored with my faith as we were maybe trying to talk and as a family on their level, and I'm up here and they're younger. And And yeah, I know this stuff, or, it's not as exciting as sports. I was into sports. And so it took me a while. I was a late bloomer in terms of, okay, well, I know Jesus is the truth.
Right.
It hit by the time I was 12. I knew it. I was convinced. But I didn't really make it my own until probably 19, 20 years old. So
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good to hear your story a little bit. And, since again, moving here to Lincoln, Nebraska, I feel like everyone is a Husker fanatic, but you definitely,
I fit that bill.
You fit that bill really well. But again, I think that's one of the things I love that, you bring to the tables a lot of different skills and talents, and that, you write. So I know you love writing blogs and perspectives on Husker football, especially. And but yeah, I don't know if I'm not going to place yet of degrees of fanatic.
Well, it's Jesus, and then Carly and the kids, and then there's Husker football. I mean, CH too, right? Like what we do professionally,
right?
But like, in terms of, I mean, it was like, I kind of joke about it. But I think sports is such a, and I know that you think this too, you know, as a Pittsburgh sports fan, but sports is a beautiful thing that brings people together in ways that I actually think it's a great analogy for the church. Like you go to a Husker game and like, I'm giving high fives and hugs to people that I would probably never hang out with.
Right.
Like just based on, the 5 minutes of conversation I had with you. What do you do? Where are you from?
Right.
You're dressed differently than me. You look different than me. You probably live in a different part of town. We would probably never hang out, but we're here celebrating together. And I just think that's a beautiful illustration of what the church is. It's like, I would probably never hang out with these people except for Jesus. So no, I love sports. We're raising our kids to be Jesus lovers and Husker fans. I feel like if we could do those two things, we'll be successful parents.
Be successful parents.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. So next question. So what early experiences do you reflect on now that has influenced your life choices and calling?
Yeah, that's great. And I know, of course, I've been prepared for this question because I asked you the same one.
Yep.
I before I get to maybe choices that I made or experiences that I had, I think, like, I was actually just talking with Brian Barrier, our recruiter here this morning, because he kind of made a joke about, something I was doing. And I just said, I'm kind of a man of many interests. Like I like a lot of things, but then I said it causes a lot of problems for me because I sometimes, could be a mile wide and an inch deep. But I don't think that's all bad. And so I think growing up, I had a lot of interests, and to be honest, in terms of academics or what I wanted to be when I grow up,
right.
I had no clue, because I'm like, well, I could do a lot of different things. I mean, I knew that I wasn't a science and math guy, so that cuts out a lot of different kinds of callings, right? Like it just wasn't my cup of tea. But when I got into high school and college, I started to realize, man, I really like to be creative with words and ideas and kind of arguments in the formal sense. My mom always said I should have been either in theater or a lawyer. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do either one of those. And I don't know why. Right. But God had a plan. So yeah, I think that I just had an interest in writing, in speaking. I've always been good in front of people. Like, people get really nervous doing public speaking.
Right.
And I loved it. Like, I'm like, I'll put me in front of the class and I'll do that. So when I got to college, there's that fateful moment as a high school senior when you have to select a major. And don't get me started on 18-year-olds selecting one thing that's going to impact the rest of their life. Right. But I chose communication studies because I didn't know what I wanted to do. But I was like, I like to communicate. I like to write. I like to speak. I like people. And so I chose communication studies, and I actually had my minor was in business. And I didn't realize that you had to take accounting. And I've gotten a lot better with numbers, but I remember, so it wasn't an early experience. My freshman year of college, I got like a 46 on our first accounting test. And I remember our professor standing up front, and she goes, I know that some of you got like a 60 or a 65. And I was like, lady, I would give my left arm for a 65. And I dropped the class because I knew I
Right.
didn't think in numbers. And of course, that's been almost 21 years now since it's been a long time since my freshman year of college. So like I'm
Right.
different. And now I've learned how to flex and
Right.
become what I need to be.
Right.
But I just couldn't see myself getting through that without failing. So I switched my minor and then I switched again. I remember talking to my dad, and I maintained my major, but I remember having a conversation with my dad. And so this is one of those memories where
Hmm.
I think I ended up switching to religious studies. And he said something like, I think that you would do really well working in ministry. And it was a really simple conversation.
Hmm.
So you don't think you fret all that much about a minor in undergrad,
Right.
but I had to have one to graduate. And so I was like, I got to pass the classes. I got to like what I'm doing. I'm going to be doing this for,
Right.
so many hours a week. I gotta believe in it. And I've always been that kind of person. It's like, I gotta believe in what I'm doing, or I'm just not going to care all that much.
Yep.
And so I majored in communication. I minored in religion, and that set me on this trajectory. I went to a Cru conference, a winter conference. And I remember going to a seminar on like your faith in the marketplace. So in the secular workforce. And I remember coming out and just thinking like, I don't think I want to do that. And so then that kind of moved me toward considering being a missionary, being a pastor. And then I met Carly, who wanted to be a missionary. And so, while it's kind of funny, Roy, like you're like, what early experiences? And I'm like, okay, I've got to be thinking back to when I'm 6. But now I'm like,
right,
these are 20 years ago. Like these are the early experiences of my life when I was 20. Right.
Right.
So I remember meeting Carly. At some point, we had a conversation about what we wanted to be when we grew up. And here we are in our 20s. And we both said to each other, we could see ourselves being single and serving in the mission field. And then here we are now, married, right? So
4
serving
kids
together with 4 kids.
Right.
So, man, I think that first part of college, just struggling to figure out, like, man, what do I want to be? And the big obstacle between now and then is this thing called college and a degree. And I have to decide this. And it was burdensome. It was heavy. But I think at the end of the day, what God was doing in my heart was just saying, I don't really care what it is you do, but I want you to do it for me, whatever it is. And then I think that second thing is eventually, like, I knew I wanted to do it with Carly. Like it was, and it really didn't matter where we were. Right. I mean, she and I, we've lived in Nebraska. We lived in New York. We've lived in New Mexico. We're back now here in Nebraska. Before we were, together, she had spent some time in Japan, and then we were engaged, and I was in South Africa, and we were waiting to get married, but I was serving there. So We've been all over the place. And I think for us, it's always been like it, that early time in college. And I really thank Cru for this. It was like, Lord, I'll just go wherever you want me to go.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter where I am, but it does matter, that I have a mission in whether I'm an engineer or a journalist or a teacher, whatever. I have a mission, and then I know who I'm doing it with. And at first it's Carly. Eventually it became, the staff at our church, the staff with Cru, the congregation we were a part of, that kind of stuff. But, that early college just experience of, man, it feels like torture, but I knew, looking back now, like, okay, God was doing something to prepare me to say, it doesn't really matter. And so now I'm at this place where I'm like, okay, it's Christian Heritage. And if that's for 5 years, great. If it's for the next 50, great. But now I know that God is not waiting for me to feel like I have all the answers. And I think I really had to work through that in college. So I think in terms of, man, what experiences impact where I'm at today, it was having to go through that process that just felt so heavy. It felt like the weight of the world was on your shoulders. Right. So, yeah.
It's fascinating just kind of hearing that when I think about Karen and I in our story a little bit, similarities of, we could go our separate ways. And I
Yep.
didn't get into this a lot in my story, but, we went through a broken engagement. And part of that was, I think Karen was like, she wanted a lot of stability, but I think she saw my life as like, I'm not going to get that house with the picket fence with this guy. Like,
Yep.
he's like, she knew I had a strong call in my life, but
Yep.
eventually, obviously now almost 28 years of marriage and 3 kids.
Yep.
But I remember those early years after college of, making those significant decisions of, no, we want to partner together. And we've done that as well. I mean, I think that's
Yep.
probably, again, some of the similarities of our story that I've appreciated is this, collaborative experience in regards to I don't have a wife just saying, "Hey, follow me."
Yep.
I have a wife who together and now with
Yep.
our children are making significant decisions around ministry. And even as we get closer to empty nesting, it's the same thing. It's like,
Yep.
here's the next phase and
Yep.
of what that looks like. And so as you're sharing all that, I
Mhm.
just, yeah,